Afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the final Hub Cures event for this season. As you all know, these Hub Cure events were designed to sort of get people ready with a platform, this new online platform, and on our way to our big event, which is MALSI Plus, which is happening next week on July 22nd. And if you haven't already registered for MALSI Plus, a link will be posted in the chat that will allow you to go straight to the registration. We've already got several hundred people registered. We've got an amazing lineup of content, an investor panel, a pharma innovation panel, and our lunch keynote speaker, Barbara Fox, moderated by Kate Sheridan from STAT, being introduced by Kendall Ryan from MassBio. So incredible content. We have 20 great poster sessions, poster presenters. They've been selected, and if you follow social media, you'll be seeing who those presenters are going to be. And of course, we'll network. And it is a virtual event. There will be networking similar to the networking tables here, but we're also once again using Curious Reactor to do one-on-one networking. So be sure to quickly fill out a little profile on Curious Reactor, and that's a algorithm-based system that connects people on a one-on-one basis and creates matches. Last year at MALSI we had over 300 of those matches made. And we already have many that have already been made to date with the people who've registered. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dale and Todd and to talk about the Broad Institute.
Here we go. Thank you, Renee. Hello, everybody. My name is Dale Vandermark. I'm a partner at McDermott, Will & Emery, an international law firm, and I practice in the healthcare and life sciences practice groups, particularly focused in the digital health area, where we see a lot of crossover between the healthcare and life sciences industries. And I'm really very thrilled tonight to have this opportunity to have this discussion with Todd Golub, the director of the Broad Institute. We'll learn a little bit about what the Broad has been doing over the course of the pandemic, but also really get into some of the fundamentals of what the Broad is really all about. It is truly a fascinating institution. So first, a little introduction to Todd. He is, as I said, the director of the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard, and he's the founding member and director of the Gerstner Center for Cancer Diagnostics at the Broad Institute. He's also a member of the faculty of the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute and Harvard Medical School. He's strongly committed to training young scientists and empowering them to take risks on bold ideas with transformational potential. And I think we'll hear a little bit more about that when we learn a little bit more about the Broad. He's also a world leader in understanding the basis of cancer by creating and applying genomic tools. He's made fundamental discoveries in the molecular basis of childhood leukemia and laid the foundation for the diagnosis and classification of human cancers using genomics. He's also pioneered the development of new cell-based approaches to drug discovery for cancer and other diseases. He joined the faculty of the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute and Harvard Medical School in 1997. At the same time, he served as the leader of cancer genomics at the Whitehead Institute, MIT Center for Genome Research, which evolved into the cancer program at the Broad Institute, which he directed from 2004 up until very recently in 2021. He's currently the Charles A. Dana Investigator in Human Cancer Genetics at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute and Professor of Pediatrics at Harvard Medical School. He's a recipient of multiple awards, too numerous to list, and in 2014 was elected to the National Academy of Medicine. He served on the scientific advisory boards of numerous organizations, including serving as chair of St. Jude Children's Research Hospital and the board of scientific advisors of the National Cancer Institute. He received his BA from Carleton College and his MD from the University of Chicago Pritzker School of Medicine. And he completed his internship, residency, and fellowship training at Boston Children's Hospital and the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. Todd, it's a great pleasure to be speaking with you today.
Thanks so much, Dale. It's great to be here for this fireside chat. I wish I could see everyone who's online, but it's great to be together and talk about the Broad.
Well, hopefully we'll be able to be in person sometime soon and be able to actually shake hands and break bread together like we used to in the old days. But Todd, I'd like to get started in this discussion. First, if you could, just give us a general introduction to the Broad.
So the Broad is this crazy experiment that continues to evolve, and I think that's part of the idea of the Institute from the very beginning. And the idea of the Broad Institute is really grounded in the fact that it's based here in Cambridge, Boston, in this amazing ecosystem of really world-class academic research organizations, world-class companies. And I would say kind of the last thing we need is just another great academic organization. And yet there was something kind of missing, what I like to refer to as a horizontal connector between the great hospitals, Harvard and MIT, that would allow scientists with big ideas to take on projects that were bigger than themselves, something more ambitious or outside of their own comfort zone that could really have an impact for the whole ecosystem, but would really be tough to pull off in an individual traditional academic lab. And it might not make sense to take on in a company. And so it was kind of with that spirit that the Broad was born in 2004, really grounded in the first draft of the human genome sequence, which was another great example of something that, having the human genome sequence was something that we could agree was going to benefit everybody, academic researchers, scientists, and companies. Wouldn't make sense for a single company to take on that project, and isn't the sort of thing that a graduate student or two or three could just pull off as part of their dissertation project. It required a different kind of beast: infrastructure, scale, technology, computation, biology, all rolled up together in a real goal-oriented way. And that was sort of the spirit of the Broad. And so the details of what specific projects would be taken on will certainly evolve over time, but I think it'll continue to be this place that sort of functions at the interface of multiple groups and technologies and disciplines around Boston, and takes on projects that would benefit the public good, but are hard to otherwise pull off.
Well, being at that epicenter, I really have, I think, two questions about that. One, how do you really make collaboration work, really, when you're dealing with so many institutions that have come together to support the Broad? Has it been the attention to the mission by all of the organizations and that real commitment? Are there structures in place that help you develop that collaborative spirit within the institution? Maybe you talk a little bit about how you make it work. What's the secret sauce?
Yeah. Well, first I would say I think there's a bit of a fallacy that academic researchers don't like to collaborate and they like to keep everything secret and do everything themselves. Maybe some element of truth to that, but most academic scientists collaborate in one way or the other. But I think in the end, what really drives collaboration at the Broad is the mutual recognition that there's a common goal that everyone would like to, that a group of people would like to see happen, and that they simply can't pull off on their own. So it's not, I would say, entirely, devoid of self-interest, because, individual researchers or groups may have a real interest in seeing something happen, a data set created, a computational tool, analytical tool developed, a new technology developed, because they'd like to use it too, but maybe really pulling that off, they can't do on their own. And so there's real, I call it, enlightened self-interest, that by working together, you can create something that's bigger than yourself, but that you really want and will benefit. And it's great that it benefits other people too. I don't think that collaboration that is stimulated by, well, let's just get random people together and stick them on the same floor in a building, I don't think that really works all that well. And even I'm a little suspicious of funding mechanisms that are sometimes developed to encourage collaboration by working on, having funding streams that are only available to people who agree to collaborate with each other, sometimes encouraging new collaboration. That's all fine. But I think when there's not an actual need to collaborate to accomplish a goal, people will figure out how to go back, take their resources and go back in their own corners. So I think the single most effective driving force for collaboration is a common goal that then automatically incentivizes people to row together to reach that goal. And the concept of the Broad administratively is to get out of the way, to just let that happen. Because too often, I think what we found is that scientists, maybe from different departments or different universities or hospitals or whatever, or even including companies, would share a common vision for what's needed. But then the administrative hurdles to go through in order to pull that off would just make you instantly exhausted. Not instantly exhausted. It would take like a year to figure out how to write a joint grant or to, get over intellectual property complexities and that sort of thing. And so the goal of the construct of the Broad was to say, let's try to eliminate as much of that crap as possible. Solve it up front so that in a completely grassroots way, if scientists want to come together across departments, across universities, institutions, just go do it. No one's going to tell them what to work on. It's entirely self-driven collaboration. But let's make it easy for them to do that, not hard.
Right. And those goals, the second question, how are they developed? Do they come organically from the researchers? Do you have a particular mandate for particular areas? How do they come about, and how is agreement reached on specific goals?
Well, first of all, you have to understand that unlike a company that might have a central pot of resources that can then be deployed in a pretty much completely fungible kind of way, most of the resources of the Broad Institute come from the usual places, from the NIH, from philanthropy, from industry collaborations, that individual PIs, garner those funding mechanisms. However, there is a strong component of scientific communities coming together and saying, okay, we've all got our grants and our projects and whatever, but what could we take on together that we would all benefit from? And let's figure out how to do that. Maybe we can figure out how to do that by bringing together our existing resources. Maybe we'll have to go out, raise some money to support that effort, but start with the grand vision. I think what happens, my sense is that in particularly young people often start with really big ideas and an altruistic vision around how they're going to really impact the world, help patients, and so on. And somehow the system wrings a lot of that big vision out of them because they find it difficult to get traction on projects, to get enough funding to do what they want to do. And so that sort of big vision and ideation, change the world kind of thinking, over time sometimes becomes okay, I've got a grant of this amount of money, and I have these resources available to me. What could I do with it? And that becomes a very small-minded kind of exercise. And so part of what we try to do, and particularly for young people coming into the Broad community, is say, well, pretend you could have whatever resources you need. What do you really want to do? Not what do you think is practical, not what do you think would make for, a publication, not what do you think is the experiment to do because it would enable you to get grant funding, but what do you really want to do? Don't worry about how big it is or how audacious it is. What does that look like? Let's think about that together. So there's no mandate for what people should work on, but there's encouragement to help people think about what they want to accomplish. And if that means doing that collaboratively, do it collaboratively, because if you can make the pie bigger by doing something audacious and awesome, it will bring plenty of glory and funding and all the rest in publications to you as an individual. You're not actually falling on your sword by thinking big and working collaboratively.
It sounds like a wonderful work environment for researchers. I can't imagine the joy you must get out of seeing that occur. And it does lead to my next question, which is really, what is it? And I think getting some of the answer already, but what is it about the Broad that really excites you?
Yeah, I think it is this spirit of taking on projects that are really going to have a big impact and will benefit everyone. And that if you do something really important, the rest will fall into line. The funding will fall into line, the publications will fall into line, tenure will fall into line, spin out companies will happen. All that stuff kind of happens automatically. I think if you don't think about it that way, it's a struggle to get those other things. And so what I'm most excited about is seeing what can happen when people think that way. And when people think in a way that's not instantly constrained by the immediately feasible. So that, if there's the need to create infrastructure, well, maybe we should figure out what would it take to create that infrastructure. Maybe it's worth it and we should commit to doing that. That's exciting to see. And so whether that's around, maybe we're going to need large-scale COVID testing. What would that look like? That's, we'd never done a single COVID test before, but having an audacious goal like that and being unafraid to think it through, as long as we were convinced that the activity would have impact, that's a cool thing to see happen. So I'm excited about that.
Well, that's leading right up into my next question. Of course, COVID is the topic of many discussions these days, as it should be. And the Broad played a very significant role when it comes to testing. Maybe you can just give us some details around how that came about and what it was that you actually did and achieved.
Yep. So I think this is something that we're really proud of as an institute, and in particular, Stacy Gabriel and Sheila Dodge and Niall Lennon and Tim Desmet, leaders of the genomics platform at the Broad, really took this on with gusto. I think they had the vision, together with Deb Hung and others in the community, in the Broad and Harvard Hospital community, to see that there was going to be a need for large-scale testing that needed to be affordable, needed to be super high quality, because if it wasn't high quality, the public was not going to trust it, and that public trust was really important. Needed to be fast, otherwise it wasn't going to be actionable. And I think this was an example where, in principle, where there's a real need like that, companies should flow in to address the issue. I think COVID testing was a bit unusual to the extent that maybe lasted a bit longer than people thought. But even in that extended period, there was this period of immense, very high scale need, which we can all hope is then going to go away. So that doesn't make for a great business model for a for-profit company. And there was a need for a testing capability that was kind of infinitely scalable, which in our mind meant being modular, not dependent on, very customized, specialized instruments that you can't grow instantly, or that might have very specialized reagent requirements. And so what the genomics platform leadership team stood up was an entirely modular PCR-based testing capability that had no special components to it. Off the shelf robotics, instrumentation, reagents, and so on, with a lot of attention being paid to operational excellence, supply chain concerns, with the expectation that this might need to scale to some large number. And indeed it did. Now, well surpassing 20 million tests since the pandemic began, with the concept being that needs to be fast, needs to be high quality, but needs to be affordable. And so I think one thing we're particularly proud of is driving down the cost, in particular for nonprofit colleges and universities and organizations that depended on this testing, to get the price as low as it could possibly be. And so that involved hiring a bunch of people to take on this new activity and creating, new instrumentation and so on. And thankfully, we're now in the position of that need winding down. I hope it doesn't come back, but should there be a need to, we know how to scale it back up.
What were some of did you learn some fundamental, I'll call it truths, probably the wrong word, about testing and going through this process that you think you might be able to apply elsewhere in terms of your research? Or was this really just a focused, hey, we've got to get this done, let's figure out the best way to make it work, and we found an interesting way to do it, but there isn't necessarily all that much we learn from it?
Well, I think in the heat of the moment, it very much was, we need to focus singularly on this one thing and stand it up and get it running without thinking about the big picture at all, and what extensibility it might have. I think now actually we're in a position where we should be considering exactly what you're referring to. Hopefully there will never be a situation in the future where we need a rapid response for pathogen testing, but we should never be in a position again where we're not prepared to do that. There was too much scrambling. We felt like we were successful standing this up, but places, like the Broad or other, there should be national preparedness for exactly this scenario going forward, so that it's very clear what needs to happen, where it's going to happen, who's responsible for it, where the funding is going to come from, how the reporting is going to happen. We may not know what the pathogen is today, but we can expect that there's going to be a need and value to being more on top of this than we were. So yes, New England turned out to be in good shape because the Broad was able to do this, but that's not a great solution for the country going forward. So I'm hoping that out of the new administration in Washington, there will be an effort to think about this, more generally for the future.
Well, let's hope so. I know public health funding has decreased. It's been widely reported. It would be good to see that funding come back online for a variety of reasons. But the notion of lost infrastructure or needed infrastructure for the next pandemic is certainly one that we should be thinking about, and hopefully we are.
Yeah, and I would say it's not a trivial question, because if you say, well, okay, here's what we want you to be able to do: go from zero testing for a long period of time, and then be able to rapidly get to 20 million tests, and then wind it back down to zero. How do you do that in a cost-effective way that ensures that you're always at the cutting edge of technology, so you're able to do it, at high quality and low cost and so on? It's not a trivial thing, but it's an exercise we should be thinking through, as a nation, very carefully.
Yeah, the United States, of course, public health is largely a matter of local, state and local government response. Did you experience in the process of rolling out your testing some of the inefficiencies that can come from that? Because, of course, all of those different responses create inefficiencies, just as they create experimentation, right, to identify some of the better responses or more effective responses. But in something like testing, it seems like that's a national priority. That's not something that we would like to, I would think, leave to local jurisdictions to figure out how to do best.
I think that's right. Certainly creates inefficiencies and creates confusion when different people stand up different tests and there aren't clear standards, and not a clear clearinghouse for even the reporting of results. That took a while to come up to speed. So I think this was in my opinion, this is a clear example of where a national strategy makes a lot of sense. That is not to say having a nationally executed effort through like a central lab, one central national laboratory, but having clear national marching orders would have made a lot of sense.
Right. Well, I want to switch gears. I mean, we could talk a long time, I think, about the pandemic response. Switch gears just a little bit and just ask you a little bit of a personal question, but you took over the Broad at I'll call it an interesting time. How has that transition, or I should say, you've come into this leadership position at an interesting time. How has that transition worked in the midst of the response to the pandemic?
Yeah, well, it's been an interesting past 6 months, and certainly Eric Lander's shoes are big shoes to fill. But I've just felt so enormously supported by Brodies and others all around Boston that's really been a great pleasure. And I think it's been a terrific opportunity. Yes, in the middle of a pandemic, which is a bit inconvenient, but nevertheless, it's a great opportunity to take stock of, okay, there's a lot to feel great about the Broad Institute, but we're not really one to rest on our laurels. What we should be leaning forward kind of continuously and thinking about what's next. In what ways can we have the greatest impact? Maybe that's continuing to do what we've been doing, and I'm sure we will continue a lot of important work that's been the foundational for the Broad. But we should seize this leadership transition as an opportunity to think about what are some new directions that make sense for the Broad to lean into. And so I've been excited about working with my colleagues to think about those areas. Some that we're working through now are thinking about therapeutics and innovation around drug discovery. Seems to me there's enormous potential for places like the Broad to contribute to this amazing biopharma ecosystem that's anchored in Cambridge, where certainly places like the Broad are not going to replace even, small parts of that ecosystem. But I do think that there are aspects of therapeutics discovery that would benefit from new kinds of innovation, new kinds of activity that, as I said earlier, might be tough to pull off in a typical academic lab because maybe it requires a lot of scale or infrastructure, might not make a whole lot of sense for individual companies to take on because maybe it's something that will benefit all biopharma companies, and therefore it's not really possible to appropriate the entirety of the financial value of that activity. It's more like a public good, but it's a public good that requires serious capabilities and collaboration and mission-driven, goal-oriented, often infrastructure requiring kind of activities. And so thinking about what are those therapeutic opportunities, there's this explosion of human genetics insights in particular that's not just come out of the Broad, but human biology is just in this amazing golden period now. And it turns out it's pretty complicated. It's not as simple of, oh, here's a list of targets, just, go forth and make drugs against them. The biology is really complicated. And so thinking about how to bring therapeutics discovery into that complex human biology world is a challenge. And so I think that places like the Broad, yes, we could write genetics papers and so on and just, throw these observations over the fence and hope that others will pick them up. But I think there's going to be an important role for places like the Broad to de-risk some of these emerging biological ideas, emerging, not yet precedented approaches to drug discovery. And then at some point, it's going to be more appropriate for those projects to transition into companies to take them all the way, into the clinic and to benefit patients. But I think there's an important scientific de-risking activity that I'm not convinced is going to happen automatically. And so we're increasingly committed to being active in that space and partnering with companies. Again, we have no aspiration to take these projects to the clinic on our own. We like working not only with academic collaborators, but increasingly we're partnering with companies, biotech companies, investment companies, big pharma companies, to develop joint teams to take on early drug discovery projects that, rather than a handoff to a company, become more of a gradual transition to a company where companies are involved in the earliest, maybe whiteboard stage of an idea for a therapeutic approach, even if the majority of the work is happening at the Broad. And then Broadies are at the table, in late preclinical development. And as compounds make it into the clinic, Broadies are at the table thinking about scientific strategy in the clinic, learning from clinical trials, learning from that clinical experience. But at that stage, I think companies are appropriately doing the heavy lifting for those projects. And so that kind of seamless transition from Broad to company, I think is an exciting paradigm that we're finding to be increasingly effective. Maybe just mention one other area of sort of new direction for the Broad, and that's going to be at the interface of machine learning and biology, where certainly this intersection of computational science and biomedicine is not a new concept, but I think the Broad has a special role to play in that ecosystem because we're able to generate data at scale when that's needed. And there are now these amazing tools for large data generation that is often required to make the most of modern machine learning algorithms. And so rather than being in a sort of passive situation where often computationalists find themselves saying, okay, here are some existing data sets, try to make the most of them, we're launching a new center, the Eric and Wendy Schmidt Center, that is going to focus at this intersection of biology and machine learning, where biologists and MLers can come together and say, okay, what are the hills that need to be climbed together? what are the data sets that need to be generated to be able to do the kind of computational inference that we'd like to be able to do, and to not only make predictions about biology and medicine, but to develop mechanistic insights based on the computation. And so to have the computational spec and needs define what data are generated and then go off and generate it, and to really try to get that iterative cycle of data generation, analysis, more data generation, more analysis, to really get that to be an iterative, productive cycle. I think that there's actually a lot of fluff in this world of biology meets computer science, and we're committed to really figuring out how to make this really useful and productive, and figure out where is there a lot of progress to be made and where maybe not so much, or maybe not yet, because either the data that's needed aren't yet approachable or tractable, or the methods aren't there yet to make it possible, or it's too expensive at this moment to get the data that's needed, even if you can hallucinate what that data set might look like. But to try to get clarity around that. And I think getting computational scientists and biologists thinking together, it's this rowing together thing, again, where if you have computationalists and biologists say, okay, we have actually the same problem we want to solve. What's going to be needed computationally or biologically to get there? I think that's kind of exciting. And I think it's possible that the world of biology is going to be the world that's driving a next generation of computational tool development. No offense to Netflix competitions and things like that, and ways to sell more ads, but it'd be awesome if we can bring that same computational power to bear on the pressing problems in biomedicine.
I'm a big fan of a digital health professor at the University of Edinburgh. She wrote an article many years ago about the difficulty in digital health tool development because of the different language that technologists, healthcare workers use to talk about an issue, or even to approach how they develop solutions to issues. Different frameworks, perhaps different business necessities driving different perspectives, creating some difficulty in communication between the disciplines. And I'm wondering whether you're seeing some of that same sort of difficulty at times in getting people to be able to communicate effectively across the disciplines that you must be working with when you're talking about bringing in AI technology into the core biology.
For sure. And I think, generating a cohort, a generation of bilingual scientists is going to be a key component of this whole thing. I think, in my estimation, there's a lot of computational work that is working on problems that don't need a solution. And it's not ill will, it's that the computationalists don't know don't have the language, the toolbox, or the insights to know what are the most important problems to solve. And the biologists usually, not often, almost always, don't have enough sophistication computationally to know what's hard or what's easy. What they think is really hard and impossible sometimes turn out to be not so hard. And what they think is sort of trivial turns out to be much more complicated than they think. And so I think growing communities that learn to speak each other's language, maybe never becoming card-carrying experts in the other domain, but sufficiently bilingual to be able to focus on the right questions, scientific questions that need solutions, and to have enough of a sense of what's feasible, and then say, okay, yeah, this is tractable in 2021, so let's go for it. It's not some fantasy, and it's also not some trivial problem that no one cares about. My least favorite project is one that is successful and then it's a yawn because it doesn't really move the needle. It just makes an incremental difference. It's not enough of an advance to get anyone excited.
Well, as a lawyer who works in the healthcare and life sciences sectors, I can definitely attest to the need to be able to understand at least enough to get by and achieve the steps you need to achieve, because so much of the science, of course, is well beyond me. It's interesting. One kind of comment, and ask you to comment on this as well. But one interesting aspect of the Broad, which I find very interesting, is as you've been talking specifically about this the whole time, is really that goal of taking the research and converting it into something that can be used out in the community for whether it's testing or whether it's a therapeutic or a drug discovery, and even talking about bringing that research even farther down the line in the R&D process. I personally find that a very important component of what the Broad does, but I'm kind of curious as to whether you are seeing some benefits to that process that flow back into the research. In other words, if your teams are able to really work through this deeper process in the R&D process and see more about what goes on in that development process, are they able to bring some of that back to what they do on the research side and even on the big think side of the equation?
Very much so, and that's why, as I mentioned, we have a number of partnerships with industry, either tech industry or biotech and pharma industry, not simply because it's a source of funding for research at the Broad, but because by creating these joint teams, Broadies learn a lot and get insight into capabilities that we don't have, expertise we don't have. And so that's really an amazing opportunity beyond the funding that I think informs how we think about the next project and the next project. So I think being able to, for example, in drug discovery, even if the stage of the project today is the very earliest, most fundamental early drug discovery, aspect of the project, having visibility all the way into the clinic. What's the patient selection strategy going to be? How to even think about the market opportunity, the competitive landscape, and the practicalities of clinical development. How are you actually going to run that clinical trial and have it not take, a 3-decade, multi-billion-dollar kind of expense of a trial? Thinking about that from the very beginning is very powerful, and so that's why I'm excited about these kinds of partnerships, because it affords that kind of visibility for Broadies into that product development world and clinical development world. And I hope it's also beneficial to companies to have a lens into this exploding world of biology and technology that isn't yet readily accessible. It's not yet a commodity that you can just buy off the shelf. It's emerging stuff, and it's a way for companies to experiment with new approaches, new tools, new ideas, and in many cases then say, okay, that was cool, we're going to implement that internally. And we see that as that's a great victory. We'd be disappointed if companies didn't take these ideas and use them, in their own work. We don't see that as, oh, you stole our ideas. I'd be disappointed if none of that ever transitioned into the for-profit sector. So I see this as really mutually beneficial.
Oh, it's a great mission. And looking at the time, I realized we were running out of time, and I haven't prevailed upon the audience. If you do have a question, please use the chat function. We'll get to it. And if anybody does while they're typing, I'll just ask you my final question. In terms of just looking into the future a bit, you talked a little bit before about maybe rethinking some things now in light of the experiences with the pandemic, but maybe get a little bit more specific. What is exciting to you right now in terms of what the Broad is looking at? What are those areas that you find the most interesting and compelling?
Well, I don't want to choose a favorite project or program, but I'll mention one area that I think is very exciting, and that's the world of psychiatric disease. Schizophrenia, for example, which, enormous suffering, patients and families with major psychiatric illness such as schizophrenia. Not a whole lot of progress coming out of either the academic world or industry in making new diagnostics, new therapeutics, or really, bending the curve at all in terms of bettering the lives of those individuals. The Broad made a big bet that going deep on the human genetics, finding risk genes associated with alleles of genes associated with increased risk of major psychiatric diseases, would not create a test for are you going to get schizophrenia or not, but would provide the first clues as to the biological basis of the disease. And if you had clues as to the biological basis of the disease, then for the first time, there'd be a rational basis for thinking about therapeutic development. There were a lot of naysayers who said, well, no, it's not clear that there's really genetic basis of schizophrenia that's all that strong. It's just going to be a bunch of weak effects. You're not going to see anything. And in fact, the earliest genetic studies weren't all that promising, but they were underpowered. And so the Broad and the Stanley Center leadership at the Broad Institute doubled down on this concept and said, no, once we're powered with enough cases and controls, the signal will emerge. And now it's clear that the signal is very clearly emerging. And so now there's this whole raft of genes that are falling into coherent biological pathways that make for the first rational starting point for novel drug discovery. And so now we're seeing the rest of the ecosystem coming alive with interest and saying, oh, now we know what to work on, whether it's from a basic neuroscience perspective around synaptic pruning and other hypotheses, or from a drug discovery basis, seeing biopharma showing a renewed interest, still very risky and tough drug development path, but renewed interest because now there's a grounding in the biological basis of these disorders. And so that's something that I'm both proud of the Broad for creating these foundational resources that we make freely available to the community. And this is, I should make it clear, an international consortium of not just Broad scientists, but international collaboration to create large-scale data sets fully available on the internet for all researchers to benefit from. And now starting to march down that path of genetics to biological mechanism to beginning drug discovery. And so the genetics isn't done. The neuroscience isn't completely understood yet, but it doesn't need to be to get going on therapeutic direction. So I'm excited about that as a new deepening direction for the Broad Institute going forward.
Well, that's fantastic to hear. Obviously, mental health has been more and more focus in the United States and actually worldwide, which is a great thing. It has been something that has been under-examined and also under-treated. So hearing that is fantastic news. And with that, we're going to have to end our chat so we can go into the networking rooms. But certainly, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been fantastic. I certainly learned a ton and enjoyed it immensely. And good luck for your continued efforts with the Broad. I know I'll be following very closely and looking forward, hopefully, to being able to see you in person fairly soon once we get beyond this pandemic.
Likewise, great to chat with you. Thanks, everyone, for listening. See you soon. Bye.
Hi, everyone. You have me back. Priya just messaged me saying her internet's a little unstable and, keeps getting dropped. So in closing, I wanted to thank both Dale and Todd. That was a very, very interesting 45 minutes or so. It has been recorded, so if you want to come back to it, and I'm sure there'll be lots of other people listening who weren't able to participate today. Please do join us for networking. We'll keep the networking tables open, as long as people are around. Hopefully Todd and Dale will also join some of the networking tables. And again, please do register for Mulsi Plus 2021. There is a button right here next to the sort of photo of yourself. If you put in a photo, sort of the top right of the video of the screen, that'll take you straight to the registration page. And besides that, we wish you all a great summer, and hopefully we will get to see you soon in person sometime later this summer. Please join me on the networking tables. Thank you.